The Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a shocking military campaign and the major turning point in the Vietnam War. On January 30, 1968, the North Vietnamese Army and Southern Communist rebels known as the Viet Cong launched a number of coordinated attacks against the U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. The series of surprise attacks, named for their occurrence during the Lunar New Year, or Tet, led to a significant two-month struggle, altering the course of the Vietnam War. Here, we'll summarize the events of the Tet Offensive, its aftermath, and its legacy as the turning point in the Vietnam War. U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. officially entered the Vietnam War in 1964, after years of denouncing communism and sending secret operations in aid to the conflict. For the next 4 years, President Lyndon B. Johnson would send over 500,000 troops into Vietnam, sparking significant protests from American citizens. Most warfare in Vietnam consisted of guerrilla-style combat rather than large orchestrated battles. Viet Cong soldiers launched hit-and-run style attacks and ambushes, and U.S. troops conducted search-and-destroy missions on a small scale. On January 30, 1968, however, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the largest series of surprise attacks on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities. The Tet Offensive. That Lunar New Year, or Tet, North Vietnamese troops launched massive surprise attacks in mountainous regions on the Laos-Cambodia border. 85,000 North Vietnamese troops attacked 5 major cities in South Vietnam and almost 100 additional towns, villages, and military installations. They also attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, partially penetrating the walls. A departure from previous guerrilla tactics, North Vietnam intended to achieve a decisive victory that would end the conflict. But the fight was messy. The shocking strategic move marked a major turning point of the Vietnam War. The Battle of Hue. Intense fighting with many casualties continued for months. In February, one of the longest and bloodiest battles raged for over 3 weeks, the Battle of Hue. During this time, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers conducted house-to-house searches, arresting civil servants, teachers, religious leaders, and others connected to the United States or South Vietnamese government. The people rounded up were labeled counter-revolutionaries and executed. After the recapture of Hue, 2,800 bodies were found massacred, and 3,000 residents were reported missing. 150 Marines were killed, along with 400 South Vietnamese troops. North Vietnam suffered even heavier casualties, losing 5,000 men. Aftermath. After weeks of fighting, there was no clear victory on either side. The Viet Cong in North Vietnam suffered a great military loss. By the time the fighting ceased, they had lost an estimated 58,000 men. The Viet Cong also failed to take any South Vietnamese or American strongholds. The U.S. lost 4,000 troops, and more than 14,000 South Vietnamese men, women, and children had been killed. But despite a lower number of casualties, the United States did not emerge as winners either. For Americans, the offensive raised troubling questions. President Johnson and his advisors had promised for years that victory in Vietnam was just around the corner. Yet the television footage of U.S. Embassy personnel fighting with Viet Cong rebels showed otherwise. The Johnson administration had misled the American people about the realities of the Vietnam War. These realities included the brutalization of innocent civilians. In the heat of the U.S. campaign against the Tet Offensive on March 16, 1968, U.S. troops stormed the small South Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai, expecting Viet Cong guerrillas. Finding only women, children, and elderly, they raped and killed up to 500 villagers. The massacre became synonymous with American military power gone awry. Public opinion on the war shifted, and the national confidence in President Johnson's Vietnam strategy dropped to an all-time low. This led Johnson to halt escalation, pull down troop strengths, and limit bombing in North Vietnam. Discredited, he dropped out of the presidential race, opening the door for deep divisions in the Democratic Party and the victory of Republican challenger Richard M. Nixon. The president's diplomats began peace talks in Paris with their North Vietnamese counterparts. By the time of Nixon's victory in November, a majority of Americans favored a quick exit from the conflict. Though the war raged on for several more years, The Tet Offensive helped turn the tide of American public opinion against the war, paving the way for American withdrawal and the eventual defeat of South Vietnam.